They told me to step aside. I told them to watch. The moment I took that shot, I knew I was about to change everything. Have you ever been underestimated? Told that you weren't good enough, smart enough, or strong enough to achieve something? Maybe it was a passing comment from a colleague, a family member, or even a stranger. Maybe you were told you didn't belong, or that you should just stay in your lane. And how did it feel? Did it make you want to prove them wrong? Did you find the strength to stand up for yourself, or did you just walk away? I didn't walk away. I proved them wrong in the most powerful way possible. My name is Miranda Sterling, and I'm not your typical marksman. In fact, I don't think I'm even typical by anyone's standards. I'm a woman, a mother, and a competitor. Most people look at me and see someone who doesn't belong in the world of competitive shooting. They assume that because I'm a woman, I won't be able to handle the pressure or the challenge. But what they don't know is that I didn't get here by backing down from those assumptions. I got here by shattering them. It all started one summer afternoon when I decided to join a local shooting competition. I'd been practicing for months, hitting the range as often as I could, working with coaches, and developing my skills. I knew the sport like the back of my hand, but this was my first time stepping into the competitive arena, and honestly, I didn't expect to take home the gold. I wasn't there to prove I was the best. I was there to test myself, to see how far I could push my limits. The range was crowded when I arrived, a mix of experienced shooters, rookies, and a handful of instructors. Everyone was talking about the competition, but the whispers about me weren't flattering. I could feel the eyes on me. They weren't curious eyes. They were skeptical eyes. The kind of looks you get when you don't fit the typical mold. A woman stepping onto a shooting range filled with men competing against them, something that felt out of place, even to those who should have known better. I didn't mind. I wasn't there for their approval. I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to prove a point, not just to them, but to myself. I was there because I knew I could do this, and I wasn't going to let anyone, man or woman, tell me otherwise. The other competitors seemed to make a game out of sizing me up. I caught a few dismissive glances and overheard some snide comments as I prepared for my turn. It didn't surprise me. People always have something to say when they see a woman in an unexpected space, but I didn't let it get to me. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the target in front of me. Then, as I made my way to the shooting position, one of the instructors, Tony, an older guy who clearly thought he knew everything, walked up to me. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his tone far too casual. "You sure you're up for this? You know, this range is set for real shooters. Maybe you should step aside and let the professionals handle it." His words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a knife. There was that moment of silence after he spoke, as if everyone was waiting for me to back down. For a brief second, I felt the sting of his words, but then something clicked inside me. Step aside? I looked Tony straight in the eyes, but I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just set my stance, adjusted my grip, and raised my rifle to the target, in front of me. I could feel the tension building in the air, the expectation from the crowd. They thought I'd fail. They thought I'd miss. But I was about to do something they never expected. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the range like thunder. The bullet hit its mark perfectly, but what came next stunned everyone. The range's record monitor, the one that tracked the precision of each shot, shattered into pieces from the sheer impact of my hit. The force was so precise, so exact, that it wasn't just a shot. It was a statement. A single bullet, fired with controlled precision, had broken the system. The room went quiet for a moment. Everyone stared at the monitor, pieces of it scattered across the floor. And then, just like that, it was as if the world had snapped back into place. Tony, who had been smirking just moments before, stood there speechless. The smug expression on his face evaporated, replaced with confusion and awe. The other competitors, who had been silently betting against me, looked at each other, unsure of how to react. And I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, but a calm smile tugging at my lips. I hadn't just hit the target. I'd shattered every expectation. The rest of the competition continued, but I knew something had changed. The moment I pulled the trigger, it wasn't just about the score anymore. It was about showing them that no one should be underestimated, no matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. I wasn't just a woman competing in a man's world. I was a competitor, and I was here to win. The crowd slowly began to murmur, then erupted into applause. It wasn't loud at first, but the sound of it grew as Tony's earlier dismissiveness turned into stunned silence. I could feel the weight of their reactions, the disbelief that someone like me had just done something remarkable. I'd earned their respect without saying a word. As I moved through the competition, I could feel a shift. The snide comments had stopped. Instead, there were nods of approval, exchanged glances of admiration, and even a few words of encouragement. People were starting to see me for what I really was, a force to be reckoned with. I moved to the next. Challenge without hesitation, my aim true. Each shot, each hit, was no longer just about scoring. It was about breaking down the walls, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, anyone who had been dismissed, belittled, or underestimated. Tony's attempt to sideline me had only empowered me. By doubting me, he had pushed me further than I could have gone on my own. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could do it, no matter the odds. I wasn't just here to take part. I was here to change the game. The final round came, and by the time I was ready for my last shot, I was already in the lead. The competitors had been trying to catch up, but my consistency and focus had outpaced them all. They were no longer just competing for first place, they were competing for second. When the last shot was fired, the crowd was still in a kind of stunned silence, and then, as the final target was marked with a perfect bullseye, the record monitor flashed my score. It was clear. It was undeniable. I had broken the record, obliterating everything the range had previously set. As I walked off the range, the applause started up again, this time with more intensity. But it wasn't about the accolades for me. It was about knowing I had set a new precedent. I had stepped into a space where people didn't believe I belonged, and I had shown them exactly why I did. The days following my record-breaking shot were surreal. The competition had ended, and I had walked away, not just with a trophy, but with something much more valuable: respect. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore, it was about the impact I had made. The range had been buzzing with talk about the new record, and my name had become the subject of conversation wherever shooters gathered. But the exhilaration of that moment quickly gave way to something deeper, something I hadn't expected. The truth was, the victory was sweet, but the consequences of it were far from over. There was something else happening beneath the surface, something I had been too busy to notice in the immediate aftermath of the competition. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers. They weren't just the typical congratulatory messages or praise from fellow competitors. They were something else, something darker. Some people had begun to question my place in the sport, not because of my abilities, but because of the very fact that I was a woman. Did you see how fast she was in that final round? I mean, the pressure must have been too much for her. That's all well and good, but how long can she keep up with the men? It's one thing to hit a few targets, but to stay on top for long? Yeah, it's cute that she broke a record, but it's not like she can maintain this, right? At first, these remarks were subtle, whispered behind my back. But they were there, and they were growing. The doubts were spreading, mostly among those who had felt threatened by my performance. The other women in the competition, however, were far more supportive. They didn't need to say much. They just gave me the nods of approval, The kind of acknowledgement that comes from understanding exactly what it's like to have to work harder, to face skepticism just because of your gender. It didn't take long before I realized that the kind of judgment I was facing wasn't going to go away. There would always be someone who tried to diminish my achievement, to downplay the victory, to suggest that it had been a fluke. But I wasn't in this to prove anyone else wrong anymore. I was in it for myself. The more people doubted me, the more I knew that this was only the beginning. They hadn't seen what I was capable of, but they were about to. I knew I couldn't rest on one victory. One record, no matter how impressive, wouldn't change the mindset of the people who were already trying to write me off. To truly make a mark, to ensure that I wasn't just a one-hit wonder, I needed to do something that would force everyone to pay attention. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just going to settle for one victory. I wasn't going to be labeled as a woman who got lucky. I would own the sport. I would make it mine, and not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been told they couldn't excel in something traditionally dominated by men. I began to train harder than ever before. I expanded my routine, pushing myself to new limits that I never thought I could reach. But it wasn't just about physical training. It was mental. I knew that I had to continue proving myself, not just once, but repeatedly, until no one could ever question my place again. Every shot I fired, every target I hit, was a step toward building my legacy, a legacy that would be built not just on talent, but on sheer determination. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a personal battle anymore. I was setting an example for the women who were still sitting on the sidelines, still holding back because they didn't think they were good enough. I wasn't just competing for the gold. I was competing to show the world that women, too, could dominate this sport. That we weren't just in it to be part of the background. We could lead. We could win. As the months went by, the more I trained, the more I felt my confidence grow. My form became flawless. My timing impeccable. I was becoming something more than just a shooter. I was becoming an icon for a new era of women in sports, in a field where the rules had always been written by men. I began entering smaller competitions, just to keep my skills sharp and to continue making my mark. The victories kept coming, and so did the whispers. They were no longer just questions about my abilities. Now, they were starting to become challenges. The men in the sport were beginning to look at me differently. At first, it was subtle, a glance here, a comment there, but soon it became clear. Some of them were starting to see me as a real threat. There was one competition in particular that stood out. It was one of the most prestigious local events, and the prize was the title of Best Marksman in the region. The field was full of experienced shooters, many of whom had been in the game for decades. As I walked onto the range that day, I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. I could sense the judgment, the skepticism. They were all thinking the same thing. Could she do it again? I set up my gear, as I always did, and ran through my routine in my head. I knew this was going to be different. This wasn't just another competition. It was the moment that would define me. If I could win this one, I could claim my spot. I would be more than just a woman in a man's sport. I would be a force in the sport itself. As the first rounds began, the other competitors were quick to show off their skills. They fired with precision, their movements confident, their actions mechanical. It wasn't their first rodeo, but as I prepared for my first shot, I took a moment to breathe and center myself. The pressure wasn't the same for me as it was for them. They had been at the top for years, and they didn't like the idea of someone like me coming in and disrupting their peace. But I was ready. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and the target dropped with pinpoint accuracy. It wasn't just a hit. It was a statement. The crowd fell silent for a moment before a low murmur of approval spread across the range. The men who had once doubted me, who had once made passing remarks about my luck, now knew what I was capable of. I kept my focus. Each shot after that was a piece of the puzzle I was putting together. The more rounds I fired, the more I felt my confidence solidify. It wasn't about just winning this competition anymore. It was about proving that I belonged here, that I had earned the right to be here. This wasn't just a hobby for me. It was my calling. By the end of the competition, it was clear who the winner was. There were no second guesses, no question marks. I had done it. I had come into their world and defeated them. Not only had I shattered records again, but I had also proven that I wasn't just here to play. I was here to take over. And as I stood there holding my trophy in my hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for myself, but for the women who were still waiting in the wings, afraid to step forward. I was no longer just an underdog. I was a champion. I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The world of competitive shooting wasn't kind to outsiders, and especially not to women. It was a realm where men dominated, where the only way to get noticed was to be louder, faster, and better than everyone else. I had always known that I couldn't just show up and expect respect. I had to earn it. I had to work for it. Every shot I made, every target I hit, I did it to prove something, not just to others, but to myself. And now, after everything I had done to prove I belonged here, I had one last hurdle to clear. It was the big one. The one I had been preparing for since I first picked up a rifle. The championship, the final round, the ultimate test of everything I had worked for. If I could win this, I would have cemented my place at the top, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been doubted, overlooked, or told they weren't enough. The arena was filled with spectators, the tension so thick. You could almost touch it. It wasn't just another competition anymore. This had become something much larger, something far more important. It was the culmination of all my efforts, the grand stage where I would either rise or fall. I could feel the eyes of my competitors, their silent judgment as they watched me take my position. Some of them had come up to me after the previous competitions, offering forced smiles and half-hearted congratulations. But I could see through their gestures. They didn't see me as a real threat. They thought I was a flash in the pan, a one-time anomaly in a male-dominated world. But now, they would know better. The rules were simple. We had 3 targets to hit in succession, and whoever did it in the shortest amount of time, with the highest accuracy, would win. I had been training for months, honing my speed, my precision, and my focus. But this wasn't just about skill. This was about mentality. The mental game was everything. It was about how you controlled your nerves, how you stayed calm when the pressure was at its peak, how you kept your focus when the weight of the world felt like it was bearing down on you. As I stood at the starting line, waiting for the signal to begin, I could hear the whispers, the subtle but audible comments. They weren't directed at me directly, but I knew they were about me. They had always been about me. The doubts, the disbelief that someone like me could ever be a real contender. But I wasn't paying attention to them anymore. I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the target. The signal went off, and I was immediately in motion. My rifle was already in my hands, and in a split second, I was already aiming. The first target appeared, farther than I expected, but I didn't hesitate. I took a breath, lined up my shot, and pulled the trigger. The target dropped instantly. It was a perfect shot. The crowd gasped. For a moment, the noise around me faded, and it was just me, my rifle, and the target. The second target appeared almost immediately. I didn't wait. I adjusted my stance and fired again. Another perfect shot. The sound of it hitting the target was the only thing I could hear in that moment. Boom, another bullseye. My heart was racing, but my hands didn't shake. The third target popped up, and I had barely a second to think. I was moving on instinct now, a well-trained machine. I took the shot, and before I knew it, the target had fallen. Another bullseye. I didn't wait for the applause. I didn't wait for the cheering. I didn't even look at my competitors. I knew I had just set a new personal record, but I didn't need the validation from anyone else. I knew what I had done. I had just proven that I belonged here. Not just in this competition, but in this sport, in this world. I had just beaten the odds. As I turned around to face the crowd, I saw them, my competitors, standing in stunned silence. They had expected me to falter. They had expected me to miss, to mess up, to be too emotional for this kind of high-pressure situation. But I hadn't. I had executed each shot with the precision and confidence of someone who had been practicing for this moment their entire life. I could see Tony in the back, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. The same man who had told me to step aside just a few days ago was now standing there, his jaw clenched, his face flushed with the sting of having been wrong. But there was something else in his eyes. Respect. Respect I had earned with every inch of effort, with every second of doubt that I had turned into motivation. The announcer called my name, and the crowd erupted into applause. I walked toward the podium, my heart pounding, my body still buzzing from the adrenaline of the competition. As I stood there, holding the trophy in my hands, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every woman who had ever been told she couldn't do something, for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel like they didn't belong. This wasn't just about a shooting competition anymore. It was about showing the world that anyone, no matter their background, their gender, or their circumstances, could rise to the top if they were willing to work for it. The camera flashes were blinding as they captured the moment. I didn't let the attention go to my head. I didn't need to flaunt it. I knew that the real power wasn't in the trophy I held. It was in the message I had sent. It was the message that would resonate far beyond the shooting range. As I left the stage, I walked past Tony, who was still standing there, staring at me, his expression unreadable. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as I passed, but I didn't let it faze me. His opinion no longer mattered. I had shown him that. I didn't need to be validated by anyone's standards. I had built my own standard, my own measure of success. The next few days were a blur of media interviews, congratulatory messages, and, yes, more skepticism from a few individuals who couldn't quite accept what had just happened. There were still people who believed that my success had been a fluke, or that I couldn't keep up with the men at the top of the sport. But I wasn't worried. I had proved what I needed to prove. And more than that, I had changed the game. I knew that this was only the beginning. It wasn't about one competition. It was about creating a legacy, about carving out space for more women to enter this arena. I had done it. And now, I was going to make sure that more women had the same opportunity to stand on that stage and show the world what they were capable of. As I looked at the trophy in my hands, I smiled. The journey had only just begun. The days after the competition passed in a blur. My victory reverberated through the world of competitive shooting, but it was more than just about the record. It had become about something much deeper, about the idea that a single person could push the boundaries of what was expected and redefine an entire field. What I had accomplished in that competition was not simply a personal win. It was a challenge to the norms, a disruption of the status quo, and a clear signal to everyone in the sport that things were about to change. For the first time in my life, I realized that I wasn't just in this to compete. I was in it to make a mark. I had entered a space where very few women had succeeded, and I had not only succeeded, but surpassed the expectations that everyone else had for me. What started as a personal goal, being the best version of myself on the range, had transformed into a mission to change the face of competitive shooting, to show the world that women, too, could stand at the top and claim their place. But despite the accolades and the media attention, there was a gnawing feeling inside of me that wouldn't go away. I had proven myself, but I wasn't done yet. In some ways, I felt like the fight had just begun. I hadn't just shattered expectations, I had cracked open a door that was still locked for so many others who didn't have the courage to push through. And what if that door could be opened further, wider, so that more could walk through it, so that others wouldn't have to struggle as I had? A change in the air. It wasn't long before I began receiving messages, not just from fellow competitors, but from young women, from daughters, from students, and from mothers, people who had been watching my journey and found inspiration in it. One message in particular stood out. It came from a woman named Sarah, a high school student from across the country. I'm in my senior year, and I've been shooting for 2 years now. At first, I thought it was just a phase. I didn't think I was any good. But after seeing what you did, after hearing about your story, I'm not giving up. You've inspired me to keep pushing, to keep fighting. Thank you. Reading those words hit me harder than anything. I hadn't just set a personal goal, I had lit a spark in others. That spark was growing into something bigger, something that I didn't fully understand yet, but I was beginning to see its power. The ripple effect of one small act of defiance, one shot, one broken record, had begun to change lives. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the future. The day after the competition, I decided to take a moment to reflect. I walked out to the range, alone, and sat down on the dirt beside the target boards. I looked at the marks left by all the competitors before me, and then I took a deep breath, inhaling the cool air of the open space. It was peaceful here, and yet in that moment, everything felt charged with potential. I thought about the years of hard work that had led me to this point, the early mornings, spent perfecting my aim, the long hours at the range, the constant doubt in my mind about whether I would ever be good enough. It had been a journey of frustration, of struggling with people who doubted me, of making myself vulnerable to criticism. But that had been part of the process, part of the growth. I was stronger now, not just in my abilities, but in my sense of self. I had proved something, but I wasn't done. There was still more to accomplish, more to give back. I had found my purpose, and now it was time to take it to the next level. The next step. A week later, I received a call from a shooting association. They were offering me a sponsorship. I hadn't seen it coming. After all, I wasn't a household name. I wasn't a commercial star or a global competitor. But they had watched the competition, and they had seen what I had done, how I had changed the landscape of the sport. They wanted me to represent them, to show the world that competitive shooting wasn't just for men, it was for everyone. I accepted, but it wasn't just about the sponsorship. It was about what that sponsorship represented. Opportunity. The opportunity to travel, to compete on a global stage, to put my money where my mouth was, and to show the world that this wasn't a one-off victory. This was the start of something new. I used that platform to push for more inclusion in competitive shooting. I began speaking at events, at schools and at universities, sharing my story and encouraging others to pick up the rifle, to find their own voice in a space that had been closed off for far too long. The more I spoke, the more I realized just how much change there was to be made. There was a hunger for it, a desire to see more women, more minorities, more diversity in the sport. People were tired of the same old faces, the same old expectations. They wanted to see something fresh, something that broke through the barriers of tradition, and I had the opportunity to make that happen. The shift in the community. As I traveled and met people, the support grew. It wasn't just women. It was everyone, men, women, kids, older folks. Shooting for so long had been seen as a sport for the privileged few. But now people were beginning to realize that it was a sport for the people. It was a sport for anyone who had the passion and drive to learn and compete. I started seeing more young girls entering the sport, their faces full of determination, and their parents cheering them on. I saw the same look in their eyes that I had once had, the same hunger, the same fire to prove that they were more than what others thought of them. The power dynamics within the competitive shooting world started shifting too. No longer were women simply filling the gaps or tagging along in the background. They were taking charge, organizing events, and calling the shots. Women shooters were no longer just competitors. They were leaders. I knew that I had played a role in this transformation, but I also knew that it wasn't just my victory that had made this happen. It was the collective effort of everyone who had stood up against the norm, who had been brave enough to say, "I won't accept being told that I don't belong." It was the people who had faced criticism, ridicule, and doubt, and yet kept going. We had all been part of this revolution. A full circle moment. It all came to a head one cold autumn morning, a year after the competition where I had broken the record. I was standing at the range, watching a young girl take her first shot. She was nervous at first, hesitant to pull the trigger. Her father stood behind her, offering words of encouragement. As she aimed and fired, the target dropped, perfectly hit. The father's face lit up with pride, and the girl smiled, as if she had just conquered the world. In that moment, I saw the legacy I had created. This was it. This was what it was all about, the passing of the torch. A moment of empowerment, a moment of change, a moment where I could see the future of this sport unfold before my eyes. And I had been part of it. The girl turned around and saw me standing there. She smiled shyly, then waved. I waved back, a sense of fulfillment washing over me. This was the future. I didn't just break a record, I broke barriers. And I knew, deep down, that the journey had only just begun.